Night was not only a curtain, it was a roof of signs. When the sun went down and candles shrank the world to small islands of light, the sky opened into a sea more spacious than any ocean. Men and women who had no clocks read their hours in constellations and their seasons in a slow-wheeling map of fire. Moon and stars were not ornaments to the dark. They were the letters by which the night wrote its counsel. The moon ruled first. Its changes set a rhythm felt by shepherd and sailor, monk and midwife, plowman and pilgrim. New moon was a black coin slipped into heaven's purse, a night that asked for patience and kept secrets. Waxing nights brought a tender brightness, a white shaving laid along the rim of the world. The quarter moons looked like doors left ajar. At full, the moon walked the fields like a milk-pail lord, laying down paths across ponds and rooftops. Men swore that bread rose better under waxing light, and that certain herbs cut by the full possessed a keener virtue. Whether by faith or by accident, the moon's calendar reached into pots and gardens, into the timing of shearing and the setting of snares. Women watched the moon with other reasons. Monthly reckonings kept step with its phases. Midwives, counting weeks on knuckles, nodded at its disk as if to an old colleague. They swore that some children preferred to enter the world when moon and tides were full of strength, and that others, more bashful or stubborn, waited for the dark. In their small notebooks, more memory than parchment, they set little marks beside months, a private consonance between heaven's face and a child's first cry. Farmers, too, kept lunar habits, planting by the waxing light, pruning in the waning, bringing timber in when the moon was dark. Rules varied by valley and uncle and chance, yet the rules remained. A man who had learned the field by day learned the sky by night. He knew how to find his hedgerow eve when mist tricked the eye, because the old cart track lay under the Pleiades at Michaelmas and under Orion at Epiphany. To travel to the next parish by starlight was no rashness when a man could steer by the laded of the Great Bear, or keep his left shoulder to the belt of the hunter. Sailors were the most faithful to heaven's course. The sea gives little kindness to guesswork. A man afloat learns to love fixed things. North Star, steadfast, patient, was the nail that pinned the sky in place. Whole voyages were hung upon it. From the waist of a cog, a lad looked up, and with one palm's trick against the horizon, judged latitude as cleanly as any scholar's instrument. Moonlight on a calm sea was both lamp and lure, a path laid down in silver, as if some great pilgrim had gone before. In storms, stars vanished, and fear grew large, but the first reappearance of a single bright point in torn cloud made courage rise faster than any captain's shout. Monks mounted the stair to the tower and kept the year by the sky. Easter's wandering date depended upon the full moon after spring's equinox. Lent's beginning slid according to that, and all the smaller feasts from then to harvest took their places along the string. A careful sacristan had his table of numbers and his page of notes, but he also had eyes. He walked into the court on cold nights, and watched for first crescent or last, and smiled because God's book agreed with his own. When bells rang for the night offices, they rang not only for hours of prayer, but for places along the moon's slow road. Scholars drew circles upon wax and scratched them again with the shoulder of the stylus. They wrote the names of stars, a mixture of tongues that tasted of desert and sea, and copied diagrams of spheres moving in nested obedience. But being they clever and ink-stained, went out and tipped their heads back like ploughboys. The math was one satisfaction, the sight was another. There is no pride in measuring a thing that does not first humble the measurer. Children learn the sky by telling story. That wain was a baker's cart, forever rolling. Those three bright buttons were a giant's belts. That milky smear was spilt flour, or the breath of angels, or a road where saints walk. Each valley had its own names. Each name fell soft on small ears and stayed. Mothers soothed frightened wakings by pointing through the shutter slit. See, the hunter goes his way, he harms no child. Fathers, returning late from the tavern, lifted a boy to a shoulder and traced a line with a rough finger. There, that star will find you home. Moonlight was useful light. It whitened roads, painted hedges with a frost that could be walked through, lifted the black off ditches and streams so a sober foot could pass. Carters, pleased with profit, risked a leg or two more by it. Bakers carried flour under it. The watch preferred it for the clean cut it gave to shadow. Lovers praised it for gentleness, thieves for fairness. Moonlight reveals as well as hides. By it a careful hand could put a needle through cloth, a careful midwife tie a cord, a careful scribe seal a letter. It is its daylight, but it is enough to make of the night a room rather than an abyss. Yet the same light gave birth to fancies. A full moon was blamed for heat in the brain and restlessness in the bones. Men who had drunk too deep said the bright globe tugged at their blood like a tide. Women with sleepless infants swore the child stared at it as at a face. On some nights the circle turned red as a raw wound, shadow of the earth upon it, and a murmur went through villages. Kings would die, or fields would fail. Priests answered with reason, explaining eclipses kindly, but they lit candles all the same, and few men begrudged them the extra brightness then. Stars had their omens too, a fire that raced across the sky, burning its brief verse, set tongues going by dawn. Who threw that spear? At whom? A slow blue lamp at sea. St. Elmo's trembled on a masthead, and sailors, who knew fear's vocabulary, called it a blessing and wrapped their cloaks tighter. Long-tailed comets made the boldest bow the head. They were like messengers, too ragged for court, but too urgent to be turned away. Every age reads its anxieties in the sky. The Middle Ages saw banners there. Astrologers set up their craft at fairs and whispered confidences outside the Guildhall. A birth cast under the sign of this, a journey begun under the face of that. They had charts and seals and sentences for all occasions. The church frowned and tolerated by turns, beating back the presumption that stars rule souls, but allowing wisdom where seasons and humors are concerned. In kitchens, milkmaids had their own astrology. If stars glittered like salt flung high, frost would come. If they were dulled as if behind whetted horn, rain pressed in its soft request. Each art has its ladder, not every rung is firm. In the cold months the sky drew near. The breath of cattle plumed and faded. The wintry moon made panes of ice seem like glass for kings. Stars jingled like harness on a great unseen team. Hearths were hugged tight then, but even those who dreaded crossing courtyards lifted the latch for a look, only a heartbeat, just to reassure themselves that the lamp of the world had not been snuffed. Night air in the lungs is a tonic and a sermon. It says little, but it says it very clearly. Summer made the sky spacious. Long twilights let children play among swallows who scissored the warm air. Bats came after with their quiet mouths. The moon, rising late, found benches still occupied and songs stubbornly refusing to end. Vespers melted into crickets and owls and the private prayers of the unhurried. On the road, a pilgrim with a cockleshell on his hat walked on until the stars made stairs for his feet. He slept in a field and was woken by dew, and later in a tavern swore to others that he had never owned so much as when he had only the sky. Not all gazes were the same. A lord looked up and thought of hunting by torchlight, of hawks flown at dawn from a glove that still remembered heat. A reeve counted weather in the stars' arrangement and considered whether the mowing would begin on Monday. A beggar read no omens but accepted the wide roof as a mercy not measured. A monk, warmed by a cup after matins, recalled the psalm that speaks of the moon appointed for seasons. Different stomachs, same sky. Sometimes the heavens drew men together against fear, rather than toward it. Eclipses, meteors, comets, these brought villagers shoulder to shoulder in greens where fairs were held by day. A hush would fall like an extra darkness. Even the skeptical felt the animal part of the soul prick its ears. When it was over, laughter went up, and somebody passed bread, and a child, emboldened, tried to jump and touch Orion, which made the mothers scold and smile in the same breath. There were too the nights when stars seemed to speak directly, a widow counting her dead, laying each name out like a rosary, looked up and found a bright point exactly at the ridge of her roof, steadier than her tears. A soldier on watch, lonely enough to see angels where none walked, stared until the cold put its teeth into him and understood that courage is sometimes simply staying. A thief with a good purse paused under the eaves and noticed how the moon threw his long shadow along the wall and disliked it. He went home a different way and later told no one why. Maps were made from such gazing. Mariners drew roses on parchment and attached winds to petals. Travelers spoke of a road star that never betrayed them, Monks prepared computus wheels so that holy days would not drift into error. The great clock faces of later cities lay far in the future, for now the sky's clock went unwound and unerring, and every man who could lift his head owned it. Under such a ceiling, sleep came not as surrender but as right. One lay down with a blessing, as if the stars were witnesses. Windows were cracked to give the night a path through the room, so it would not press too closely on the chest. Candles were pinched, the last ember was spoken to, as to a dog, stay. Outside, the moon kept its watch like a discreet friend, checking the corners of lanes and counting the hours without knocking. Thus moonlight and stars made companions of the dark. They gave the night both face and measure. They eased the fear that comes when a man suspects himself the only living thing awake. They also sharpened the mystery. The more one saw, the more knew there was beyond seeing. In that sharpened edge lay the medieval bargain with dark. We will bank our fires and trust you, provided you keep your silver lamps lit and your signs in their appointed places. And most nights the bargain held. Night was not always a place of hush. It could be a stage. There were evenings when the town forgot its shadows and set its own stars ablaze, bonfires on greens, lanterns in processions, candles clustered so thick on altars that the air tasted sweet. On such nights, fear retreated to the hedgerows and the lanes filled with singing. Festivals after sunset made a different map of the dark, not islands of light, but rivers of it. Midsummer came like a dare. Longest day leaned into longest twilight, and men answered by building fires as if to salute the sun before it began to slide away. Great heaps of brush and old wood were piled on hills. Boys brought armfuls with the seriousness of priests. Girls braided flowers into rings and crowns. When the torch was put to the pyre, and it leapt, a shout rose that spoke in one syllable of harvest hoped for, of sicknesses burned away, of a year permitted to continue. Sparks went up like a migration of small souls. Dancing made circles around such fires. Feet stamped patterns that the head could not have written. Hands found other hands in the warm half-dark. Old men remembered steps they'd sworn were lost, and the young learned with laughter. Fiddles and pipes had a new voice with night behind them. The drum felt older, like a heart the earth itself lent out for a while. Couples leapt through edged flame where it ran low, a foolhardy blessing that made spectators gasp and mothers cluck, and those who had jumped grin at each other as if they had stolen from the year a coin no one could spend. Charms were made then, not ashamedly. Cattle were driven between small fires for health. Ashes were scattered on fields with a mason's seriousness. Herbs cut that night were stitched into pillows to keep the bad dreams from the door. Children rolled burning wheels downhill and called at the sun playing. Women saved embers to light the hearth on winter's worst morning. The priest, who in other months would rebuke mingled customs, often stood aside on this night and smiled, for he had seen that joy is more teachable than terror. Saints' Eves lit the church end of the street, Candlemas set flame into every hand, a river of tiny stars carried in procession while the choir taught winter what light sounds like. The candles were blessed. Some went back to houses to become lightning's answer and birthing's companion, and some remained to feed the year's great liturgy. On All Hallows' Eve, bells spoke the names of those whose mouths could no longer answer, and whose nights were longer than any farmer's families, crowded pews with grief that had learned how to sit up straight. The after dark of such nights was gaiety but gravity, and yet it cured fear better than ale. Rogation processions wound like living beads along field edge and brook. Torches bobbed, banners fluttered, litanies rattled softly from lightning and tempest, from plague, pestilence, and famine. Good Lord, deliver us. Children were solemn for a quarter hour and then tripped and had their ears tweaked. The line passed through twilight and into dark, then turned home. Boundary stones were tapped or whipped with switches so the parish would not forget itself. Night's office was to make the familiar strange. The church's office was to make the strange familiar by blessing it. Guilds claimed their own nights. A feast in the hall spilled out the door. Torches set the crest on the banner alive. A lantern shone through horn upon the seal embosomed there. After prayers and bread and speeches that took their tie, the brethren processed, side by side, past houses they had helped to roof and shops that had trusted their measures. Apprentices held their heads a little higher under dark masters stepped more carefully to show the steadiness they sold by day. If a drunk shouted, he was clapped on the shoulder and drawn into the line until he remembered his manners. The night belonged to order, merrier for being chosen and not imposed. There were secular revels that wore the church's hour like a borrowed cloak. May games ran late, with the queen upheld on a chair, and the lads with garters green finding courage that the sun had not given them. Christmastide ran scandalously long, and houses kept candles in windows as if the Christ child were lost and needed a map. Twelfth Night set cake and mischief on the board. A lord of misrule carried a wooden scepter through streets that knew the true one, but preferred for an evening to bow to laughter. The watch looked ow and shook heads tolerant as old dogs. Markets by lantern were a pageant of their own. When the harvest was too late to be weighed by day, or when fish ran so thick the boats came in at moonrise, stalls sprang up with a haste that only hunger could organize. Horn-shaded lights made apples appear to have grown halos. Bolts of cloth looked lustrous as water. Knives on a blanket put down a thin, honest glitter. Haggling in the night had a different flavor, quieter, quicker, more binding. Hands found other hands in the dark to seal bargains. The faith extended was larger when sight could not delavish. Pilgrims walked vigils. At shrines, candles built a second architecture. Ribs of flame where stone ribs rose, constellations at eye height. Chants warmed the cold and made patience possible. The trouble carried to the saint began to feel more nameable, and a named thing weighs less. On certain nights the relic was shown. There were murmurs that had nothing to do with doubt and everything to do with awe. If a cure was claimed, if a child woke easy the next morning, or a fever broke, the story took root like a planted staff and put out leaves. Night fairs came with their hazards. Lantern cloth burns quickly, children are swift, thieves swifter. A shout of fire could turn celebration to scramble in breaths. For this reason, wardens walked with buckets and beaters, and men who had drunk less than they might stood at the edge of crowds to watch flames the way a father watches boys near a river. Yet the risk itself seemed part of the warmth, a pinch of pepper in the stew. Danger attended desire in the Middle Ages, the way a dog attends a cart. In the countryside, harvest suppers made barns into halls. Doors flung wide, torches wedged in iron hoops. A piper in the manger made cows roll their eyes and accept the indignity. The last sheaf, dressed as a doll, was carried in and placed above the door to keep hunger out. A blessing rose that began clumsy and ended strong. After meat and pies and ale and songs with verses that kept producing cousins, the youngest made a ring outside and played at catching shadows. A grandfather leaned on the jam and said that night had not been so generous since he was a lad. Everyone told him he said that every year and hoped he would say it again next. At ports, when a fleet returned after long absence, the quay burned with joy. Pitch torches hissed and threw smoke thick as rope. Wives craned in the red gloom, children were held up and thrust forward, names flew back and forth over water as if they were fetch hooks. In the taverns, squalls of reunion roared until the watch hammered shutters for mercy. The sea lets men imagine they are brave. The night reminds them that bravery is in coming home and saying, "Forgive me, and thank you, and I will go again if bread requires it." Processions against fear were processions for memory. A town that had burned once and been rebuilt kept an anniversary with lamps set upon every sill. From far meadows the place looked like a hive that had remembered itself. A village that had survived pestilence walked in pairs with black ribbons tied on sleeves and candles cupped in hands. They sang softly and counted those not present and learned how to carry both gratitude and absence in the same chest. Night, which magnifies loneliness, to sometimes perform its opposite by giving many voices a shared room. Children stored such nights as treasure better than coin. The first time a boy sat on his father's shoulders to see over torches. The first time a girl was allowed to carry a candle in a line that moved like a small galaxy. The first leap through a failing midsummer flame. The first sweet shock of hot chestnuts pressed into a cold palm. The first glimpse of a saint's reliquary gleaming like daylight rehearsing. These were the bright stitches by which childhood's coat held together, warming later years when the wind became a different kind of teacher. Not all souls joined the revel. Some watched from lintels, faces half lit, content to let the crowd carry their part. A widow who had buried too many candles for 1 year stood within and held her own small light and allowed the singing to come through her like rain. A miller, wary of leaving his wheel untended to night mischief, set a lantern in the window and called that his contribution. The passers-by nodded, understanding that flower has its own hours. Festivals admit absences. Joy is a net with large and small knots. Afterwards, quiet returned like a creature that had retreated to the hedges and decided the lane was safe again. Smoke thinned, pitch traced black commas on the cobbles, wax puddled pale on stones like fallen moons. Ash was raked and kept for gardens. Garlands were hung where hens would not trouble them. Banners were folded with the same care as vestments. Children were put to bed with faces still pink and eyes still dazzled. Lovers' hands, let go at last, felt both emptier and more certain. And in houses that had been heavy, a window was opened to let out heat and let in stars. So the medieval night, which can brood and frighten, also learned to celebrate. Fire, ordered and shared, became a language. Songs carried by breath braided strangers into neighbors. Candles, blessed or bought, through a reach farther than fear could jump. After the fires of feast and the whispers of fear, after the watchman's round and the tavern's noise, the night returned to its truest work. It closed eyes. The medieval world, like our own, spent more hours in sleep than in any other single pursuit. To sleep was not idleness, but necessity, as vital as bread, as universal as breath. And yet, sleep was more than rest. It was a world of its own, half remembered, half mystical, a country that every man and woman visited each night, and yet never wholly understood. The shape of sleep. As told before, sleep came in two halves, the first and second, with an interval between. After supper, bodies yielded quickly to weariness. Work-worn muscles slackened, eyes surrendered, breath deepened. The first sleep was heavy, dragging the soul down like a stone into deep water. Then, at midnight or so, the body woke again, not always fully, but enough to turn in the straw, stir the embers, whisper a prayer. This waking was no disorder. It was expected, common to all, as regular as the cock's crow at dawn. Then came the second sleep, lighter, filled with gentler dreams, preparing the soul for morning. Families shared their sleep. In peasant cottages, the whole household lay together on pallets of straw or rushes, sometimes with livestock nearby for warmth. Parents and children huddled close, wrapped in woolen cloaks, pressed together against the cold. Privacy was scarce, but comfort was plenty. The nearness of familiar breath, the murmur of prayers, the reassuring thump of the dog settling at the foot of the bed. Sleep was communal, not solitary. It bound households as much as meals did. In richer homes, chambers offered separation, yet even then servants slept nearby, often in the same room, ready if called. Great lords lay on carved beds heaped with feather mattresses, canopies drawn, curtains pulled to keep draughts away. Yet even they heard the same creak of beams, felt the same shiver of winter nights, trusted the same prayers for safety. The difference was not in fear, but in softness of the bed, in fineness of the linen, in the length of the candle left burning at the bed's foot. Monasteries marked sleep with discipline. Monks lay on narrow pallets, heads often on blocks of wood, blankets thin, for their calling demanded austerity. At midnight, bells roused them, breaking first sleep for matins. They shuffled into choir, chanting psalms in darkened chapels, while the rest of the world slumbered. To them, sleep was not only rest, but a rhythm interlaced with prayer. To rise at midnight was to keep vigil with heaven, to prove that even in the night, light was remembered. The dreams of sleep. Dreams were but idle fancies. They were messages, warnings, mysteries. Some came heavy and nonsensical, shaped by food too rich or labor too hard. Others came with clarity, vivid and strange, and were spoken of with care at breakfast. To dream of water might mean tears or journeys. To dream of animals could foretell fortune or peril. To see saints in sleep was blessing. To see demons was warning. The line between dream and omen was thin. Scholars wrote dream books, compiling signs and meanings from older traditions. Farmers knew them too, in simpler form, carried in memory and story. A woman who dreamt of fire might fear quarrel in her home. A man who dreamt of falling might brace himself for loss. Not every dream was believed, but none were dismissed. To sleep was to open a door to another country, and no traveler returned without at least a fragment of news. Children's dreams were watched especially. Night terrors, sudden cries were thought signs of spirits troubling them. Mothers laid charms by the bed, crosses of rushes, bits of iron, drops of holy water to guard their little ones. If the child laughed in sleep, it was said angels were playing nearby. If they wept, prayers were whispered, for perhaps souls in purgatory had passed too close. Sleep's mysteries touched every cradle as much as every coffin. The vulnerability of sleep. To sleep was also to risk. Houses might burn, thieves might break in, wolves might raid pens. A sleeping man was defenseless, and so the last prayers of the night were earnest. Keep us this night from evil. Charms were set, doors barred, watchmen trusted. The curfew bell, far from being an inconvenience, was reassurance that all the town was quieting together. Even so, sudden death in sleep was a known fate, and it bred caution. To lie down at night was to trust both God and neighbor. For the sick, sleep was healer and hazard. A fevered child's restless tossing kept mothers wakeful, fearful that dreams might carry the soul away. A wounded man who finally slept deeply gave relief to all who watched at his side, for healing was said to begin with such slumber. Physicians prescribed sleep as remedy, urging quiet rooms, gentle herbs, soft cloths. They also warned of too much sleep, fearing it might sink a patient past waking. Sleep was medicine, but like all medicine it bore its own risks. The poetry of sleep. Poets and preachers alike loved the imagery of sleep. To them it was a cousin of death, a nightly rehearsal for the long rest all must take. Sermons spoke of the soul departing the body in sleep, wandering as it might at death, returning by morning if God permitted. Beds were likened to graves, dreams to judgments, waking to resurrection. Yet sleep was not only a somber symbol, it was also peace, the balm of the weary, the gift of God to his children. He gives his beloved sleep, the psalmist had written, and medieval folk knew it in their bones. Songs were sung to ease the way into slumber. Mothers crooned lullabies, half prayer, half melody, rocking babes until lids fell. Minstrels in halls ended their performances with gentler airs, lords and ladies nodding as fire sank low. Even shepherds, alone in fields, hummed tunes to themselves, songs that mingled with the calls of owls and the sigh of wind. Music was a bridge into sleep, guiding the soul gently over the threshold. Sleep and time. The night's cycle governed the day. First sleep, waking, second sleep. This rhythm meant that tasks could be divided. Some work was done in that midnight interval. Dough kneaded, animals checked, prayers said, love shared. Then the second sleep refreshed again. Dawn was not sudden but prepared for. It rose into a world already half wakeful, ready for its coming. Time itself was marked not only by bells but by bodies, by the way sleep shaped the hours. The stars, too, were timekeepers. A man lying awake could tell by their place how many hours until dawn. Monks relied on them as much as on bells. Sailors trusted them above all. Sleep was not unmeasured drifting. It was counted, watched, interpreted. The medieval world, though without clocks as we know them, was deeply attuned to the passage of hours, and sleep was its greatest measure. The unity of sleep. In the end, sleep was the one activity that ignored class, wealth, and rank. The king on his feather bed, the peasant on straw, the monk on his hard pallet, all closed their eyes, all entered the same mystery. Dreams did not respect titles, fears visited noble and common alike. In sleep, all were equal, all dependent, all vulnerable. It was the great leveler, as death would be, but gentler, giving rest and renewal instead of final parting. Sleep-bound communities. The curfew bell reminded all to enter it together. The rooster reminded all to rise from it together. Within that shared rhythm, life took its pattern. To know that neighbors slept was to feel secure. To hear a watchman's call in the dark was to know one was not alone. Sleep was solitude, but it was also solidarity, for though each dreamt alone, all slept at once. Closing the night. As dawn drew near, the cock crowed, dogs barked, shutters creaked. Embers were stirred, bread set to bake, tools fetched, animals let up. Sleep retreated, not vanquished but satisfied, leaving behind rest, dreams, sometimes a trace of fear or wonder. The night had done its work. It had frightened, it had sheltered, it had refreshed, it had revealed, and always it had closed with sleep. Thus the medieval night ended not with terror nor with revelry, but with breathing, slow and viva, in thousands of cottages and chambers. It ended with bodies curled in straw, with monks chanting themselves back into silence, with mothers humming babes into rest, with travellers stretched weary on barn floors. It ended with souls venturing into dreams, into mysteries they would half remember by day. And when the sun rose and the bells rang again, men and women stepped into light, carrying the night within them fears, the wonders, the prayers, and the peace of sleep. The village by day is a place of rhythm and familiarity, the ringing of the church bell, the creak of carts, the steady work of plough and spindle. But by night, when the fields lie silent and hearths glow faintly behind shuttered windows, the village is changed. Shadows stretch long, owls cry from the rafters of barns, and the lanes lie empty beneath the moon. In that silence fear takes hold, for in the dark crime lurks, petty theft, sudden violence, the quarrels of neighbors that flare into blood, or the footsteps of strangers who slip away with what is not theirs. Every villager knows the fragility of peace. A hen stolen from the coop, a loaf of bread missing from the bakehouse, a scythe gone from the barn. Such small losses weigh heavily where little can be spared. A thief in the night is not only a nuisance, but a threat to survival. A stolen sack of grain may mean hunger in winter. A broken fence may let livestock wander, their loss irreparable. So when the dog barks suddenly at midnight, when footsteps sound too close to the cottage wall, hearts beat faster and prayers rise in whispers. Theft is not the only shadow. Quarrel that begin in daylight may carry into darkness. Neighbors who disputed over a strip of land, a wandering pig, or a harsh word exchanged at the tavern may find anger burning hotter after ale has loosened tongues. Fists fly in the narrow lane, knives are drawn in sudden fury, and what was once insult becomes blood. In such moments, the darkness feels complicit, wrapping crimes in its cloak, hiding them until dawn reveals the wound, the bruise, or the corpse. Bandits to haunt the imagination. The forest beyond the fields are dense and deep, filled with the rustle of leaves and the creak of branches. Travelers whisper of men who lurk there, waiting to strike. They emerge like shadows themselves, faces hidden by hoods, knives flashing, demanding coin or goods. Though true bandit raids are rare, the fear of them is constant, for the thought of strangers lying in wait at the village edge is enough to chill the blood. The mothers hush children with warnings, "Do not stray too far, do not walk alone, for the woods are full of dangers." Yet crime is not always the act of outsiders. More often it is born within the village itself, by hands known and faces familiar. Hunger drives the poor to steal from their neighbors. Desperation leads to dishonesty in trade. Old grudges fester until anger bursts forth. To see a friend or kinsman accused is a bitter shock. Yet it happens often, for sin and want are woven into daily life, tightly aye, labor and prayer. When crime strikes, the alarm spreads quickly. A cry goes up, thief, thief, and doors fly open. Villagers spill into the lanes with torches, dogs barking madly. The bell in the churchyard is sometimes rung, its voice calling not to prayer but to pursuit. Men take up staves, women clutch lanterns, children huddle by hearths, and the search begins. Footsteps X through the night, the community rises together, bound by shared fear and shared anger. If the culprit is caught, the response is swift. He may be dragged to the manor house or luck in the church porch until morning, held under guard while neighbors gather to witness. Anger flares easily, cries for punishment rising from the crowd. Yet restraint too is valued, for justice belongs not to the mob but to the court. Still, the shame of being caught, bound and exposed before one own kin, is itself a punishment, a stain upon reputation that lingers long after fines are paid. But if the thief escapes, suspicion festers, whispers fill the village. Was it the poor widow with too many mouths to feed? Was it the youth known for idleness? Was it a stranger passing through or a neighbor once trusted? Eyes grow narrow, greetings colder, bonds strained. Trust once broken is not easily mended, and the shadow of crime lingers even when no proof is found. By day, the fields and cottages seem safe again. The sun chases away fear, laughter returns, and work resumes. But at dusk, when the last light fades, memory stirs. The darkness returns, carrying with it the unease that crime might once more slip through the lanes, unseen until too late. And so villagers bar doors, set dogs to watch, and whisper prayers before bed, trusting that God and community together will hold the night at bay. For crime in the medieval village is not only an act against individuals, but against the fragile web of trust that binds all together. To steal, to wound, to betray, is to unravel the fabric of safety, to tear hit in the net that keeps hunger and fear at arm's length. That is why punishment will come, swift and visible, for justice must restore what crime has broken. But before punishment, there is always the shadow, the silence of night, the cry of alarm, the racing of hearts in the dark. Thus begins the story of crime and punishment. In shadows at the edge of the village, fear walks hand in hand with silence, and the fragile peace of the community waits for dawn. In a world without policemen, we know them. Law and order in the medieval village depended on the villagers themselves. Safety was not the task of strangers in uniform, but of neighbors bound together, each responsible for the other. The system was simple, but it carried great weight. The tithing. A tithing was a group of 10 households sworn to watch over one another. Every man above a certain age was bound by oath to keep the peace, to bring forward wrongdoers, and to answer if one among them broke the law. If a thief fled, his tithing was called upon to pursue him. If a murderer vanished, his fellows were charged with finding him. Guilt was never borne alone, it was shared by the group, ensuring that no man could vanish into anonymity. In this way, responsibility spread like threads in a net, binding each person to his neighbor, making the village itself a guardian of order. The oath was solemn. Gathered before the steward or reeve, men placed hands upon the book of the Gospels and swore to uphold the king peace, to accuse no innocent, and to conceal no guilty man. Breaking such said oath was more than crime, it was perjury, a stain upon the soul. For in medieval thought, justice was not only a human arrangement, but a sacred duty. To lie in court, to protect a wrongdoer, was to endanger one's own salvation. By day, the tithing work was quiet, watching, listening, noting quarrels that might flare into violence. By night, its vigilance grew sharper. When shadows thickened and strangers passed through, members of the tithing might walk the lanes, lanterns in inn, staffs at their sides. If a cry of alarm went up, they were the first to respond, rousing neighbors, sounding the bell, chasing thieves across fields or into the woods. Their presence was a warning that crime, though possible, would not go unanswered. In towns and larger villages, a night watch was often kept. The watchman was a familiar figure, cloak wrapped tight against the chill, lantern swinging, staff in hand. He walked the streets slowly, pausing at crossroads, listening for trouble. Sometimes he called the hour aloud, his voice carrying through the darkness, past midnight and an as well. His words reassured sleepers, though to the weary watchman the hours stretched long and lonely. If he caught someone wandering suspiciously at night, he demanded explanation. Who goes there? What is your business? Strangers were held until morning, neighbors were warned to return home. The watchman was no knight, no soldier, he was a villager himself, often serving by rotation, his turn coming ye part of duty to the community. Some complained of the burden, longing for sleep instead of pacing the streets. Others bore it proudly, feeling the honor of keeping their fellows safe. Whatever their mood, the task was shared, for safety belonged to all. When a crime did occur, the alarm was swift, the cry of harrow, 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 horrow, out ad, or out, so the whole the night, summoning every man to the chase. Doors flew open, villagers spilled into the dark with torches and clubs. The hue and cry, bellows, it was barred, was not optional. All who heard it were bound to join. To ignore it was itself a crime, for the peace was common, not private. The sight of villagers running together, lanterns bobbing, dogs barking at their heels, was enough to terrify many a thief into dropping his plunder and fleeing. The system was imperfect. A cunning outlaw would slip away into the woods. A strong thief might outrun the chase. An innocent man might be accused by enemies. Yet the system worked more often than it failed, for its strength lay not in perfection, but in participation. All bore the weight of law together, and in that shared burden lay safety. The tithing was also a reminder of the closeness of medieval life. Privacy was scarce, secrets difficult to keep. Neighbors knew one another, habits, quarrels, and needs. If a crime was committed, suspicion quickly fell, and whispers spread. The guilty might hide for a time, but the eyes of the tithing were many, and sooner or later truth surfaced. At the heart of it lay the bell, hung in churchyards or on wooden frames in village squares. Its rope was ready to be pulled in alarm. When its voice rang out at night, deep and insistent, all knew their duty. Men seized weapons, women guarded children, the village rose they'd won. The bell was more than metal, it was the voice of justice, calling each person to act, binding all together in defense of peace. Thus, order in the medieval village was not imposed from above alone, but woven from within. The tithing and the watch turned neighbors into guardians, shared oaths into shields, and common duty into law. In their vigilance, the fragile peace of the village was preserved, day after day, night after night, through centuries of shadow and light. Beyond the tilled fields and the church bell reach lie the places where law grows thin, the forest, the heath, the lonely road that winds between villages. These are the haunts of bandits and outlaws, men cast from society or driven to crime, who live by the ambush and the blade. In every village, stories are told of them, sometimes whispered in fear, sometimes shouted in tavern boasts, always shadowed with unease. The outlaw is both real and imagined. Real in that many a merchant has returned home bruised and robbed. Many a traveler has vanished on the road, his goods gone and his fate gin. Imagined in that tales grow with each telling, bandits turned into demons of the forest, shadows that can never be caught. Yet whether truth or tale, the fear is the same, that the road ahead may be watched by hungry eyes. Forests, especially, carry this dread. Their trees rise tall, their shadows thick, their silence broken only by the crack of branches and the cry of distant beasts. A lone traveler stepping beneath those boughs feels the press of eyes unseen, the weight of possibility. Bandits know these woods well, their paths hidden, their hideouts secret. They strike swiftly an arrow loosed from cover, a cry of command, men leaping from behind trunks with knives or clubs. Stand and yield your purse. The startled traveler, heart pounding, has little choice but to obey. Outlaws live hard lives. Cast from their tithing, stripped of protection, they are declared outside the law. Anyone may strike them down without fear of punishment, yet as survive, clinging to life in caves or huts deep in the wild. They hunt game, steal sheep from folds, raid travelers, and sometimes trade secretly with villagers too afraid or too greedy to refuse. For many, outlawry begins with desperation, a debt unpaid, a theft committed, a quarrel turned deadly. Once named outlaw, return is nearly impossible. To live beyond the law is to live at a ghost, hunted by sheriffs, shunned by kin, feared by all. Yet tales of outlaws are not always give. Around firelight, children listen wide-eyed to stories of clever rogues who rob the rich and spare the poor, who outwit sheriffs, who vanish into the greenwood laughing. Such stories comfort, for they turn fear into play, danger into marvel. In these tales, the outlaw becomes not only a threat, but a symbol of freedom, of resistance against harsh lords and heavy taxes. Whether such men truly existed or were shaped by longing, the stories endure, woven into song and legend. Merchants fear bandits most. With wagons laden with cloth, spices, or coin, they are tempting prey. Many travel in groups for safety, hiring guards or riding with caravans. Along certain roads, inns and watchtowers rise, placed there by lords eager to keep trade flowing. Yet even so, the danger cannot be wholly banished. A bend in the road, a stretch of forest, a sudden storm, any may have cover for attack. Merchants speak often of saints' protection, making offerings before journeys, carrying charms to ward off misfortune. Still, their eyes dart constantly to the shadows, wheels creak and horses plod. Bandits aye haunt bridges and fords. When rivers swell with rain, crossings become narrow and perilous. There on the far side men may wait, demanding tolls not sanctioned by any lord. Refusal brings blows, compliance, poverty. The bridge itself becomes a trap, its timbers echoing with footsteps of fear. The punishment for banditry is harsh. Should a band be caught, their fate is swift. The gallows, the noose, the jeering crowd, lords make examples of them, for nothing endangers peace more than lawlessness on the roads. Bodies may hang for days, crows circling overhead, their sight a warning to others. Yet still, you bands rise, drawn by hunger, by greed, by the belief that luck may favor them where it failed their fellows. To ordinary villagers, the outlaw is both menace and mystery. They fear his thefts, yet secretly admire his defiance. They lock doors at night, yet whisper tales of greenwood kings. They pray for safety on the road, yet dream of freedom from lords and sheriffs. In the outlaw, they see both danger and desire, the shadow of crime and the glimmer of rebellion. As dusk falls, the village hearth seems warmer, the church bell steadied, when thoughts turn to the wild beyond. For out there, beyond the last furrow, lies the place where law is weak. Men live by knife and cunning. We a lone traveler may vanish without trace. Out there walk the outlaws and bandits, figures half real, half legend, forever haunting the edge of medieval imagination. If the church was the heart of devotion and the market the heart of trade, then the tavern was the heart of laughter and trouble. By day its doors stood open to weary laborers seeking bread and ale after toil. By night it glowed with lantern light, the sound of mugs clattering, dice rattling, voices rising in song or argument. Within its smoky walls villagers found comfort and camaraderie, but also danger. For where ale flowed, tempers loosened, and quarrels too often turned to crime. Alehouses were simple places, timbered walls darkened with smoke, floors of beaten earth or rough boards. Benches lined the walls, a heavy table stood at the center, mugs hung from pegs, and barrels waited in the corner. The smell of yeast and wood smoke clung to every beam. Women, often alewives, brewed the drink, their hands stained from stirring mash, their aprons damp with spills, for most ale was daily drink, safer than water, nourish a much of pleasure, but when too much was poured, its warmth turned to fire. Games were played, bit mugs were drained, dice clattered upon the table, men leaning close, eyes bright with hope or suspicion. A lucky throw might bring cheers, an unlucky one curses, a suspected cheat, a sudden blow. Cards were not yet common, but dice and boards sufficed to stir fortune and fury alike. Wagers were made not only in coin, but in goods, chicken, tools, even promises of labor. To lose was bitter, to win was sweet, but to suspect deceit was to ignite quarrel that could spill into the lane. Ale itself was cause for dispute. Was the mug full? Was the brew strong or weak? The measure honest or false? Alewives were sometimes accused of cheating, of adding too much water, of using false measures. The assize of ale proclaimed by crown and court set standards for strength and price, but enforcement was uneven. When villagers believed themselves cheated, tempers flared, words flew, and the steward might soon hear complaint. Yet many returned the next night, for where else would warmth and laughter be found? Violence was never far. A careless insult about land, about kin, about honor could spark a fight. Benches overturned, mugs smashed, fists flew, knives flashed too often, and wounds were common. The cry might rise, neighbors rushing in, dragging men apart, blood on floorboards, curses echoing in smoky air. The next day bruised men stood before court, fined for brawling, their names recorded, their reputance stained. Yet week later they returned to the tavern once more, as though drawn back by the same fire that had burned them. The church frowned upon such disorder. Priests preached against dice and drunkenness, warning that alehouses led to sin. Bishops ordered inspections, demanding honest measures, forbidding gambling, urging restraint. Yet even priests were seen sometimes sipping ale in corners, for the warmth of fellowship was hard to resist. Taverns endured, for they met a need old at mankind, the need to gather, to laugh, to forget labor and sorrow for a time. For villagers, the tavern was both joy and danger. Songs lifted spirits, tales lightened hearts, friendships were forged in shared mugs, yet beneath the laughter lurked quarrel, beneath the gain lay suspicion, beneath the warmth smoldered fire. Crime mere was not always planned, but born of drink, pride, and chance. And so the tavern stood, both beloved and feared, a place where law and disorder met beneath a low roof and the glow of a lantern. At night, when voices finally quieted, the last embers glowing in the hearth, the floor sticky with ale and blood, silence returned, but the memory of laughter, of quarrel, of dice and song lingered, carried into dreams. In the morning the tavern door opened again, the barrels tapped once more, and the cycle began anew. Not on crime came from the shadows of the forest or the blades of bandits. Often it rose from within the village itself, from quarrels that began small but swelled into anger, violence, and wounds that could not be hidden. For when men and wind live close, sharing fields, water, fences, and taverns, tempers are easily kindled, and the line between argument and crime is thin. The causes were old the plough, a pig rooting in a neighbor garden, trampling beans or onions, a cow breaking through a weak fence and damaging a field, a cart left in the lane blocking passage. Such slights might seem small, but in a world where every sheaf of grain mattered, where survival hung on fragile harvests, they cut deep. Harsh words followed, then shouts, then sometimes fists or knives. What began the dispute over beasts or boundary could end with blood in the dust. Water, too, was cause for strife. Villagers quarreled over rights to draw from wells, to dam streams, to turn mill wheels. The mill especially, owned often by lord or monastery, was a place of tension. A miller accused of taking more than his share of grain, of cheating by weight or measure, might face the fury of those he served. More than one miller found himself dragged into the lane, beaten by angry farmers who had endured too much. Taverns added their share of trouble. By day, they were places of ale and talk, of laughter after toil. By night, when mugs had been drained too often, they became breeding grounds of quarrel. Insults flew easily after drink, old grudges rekindled, pride stung, fists slammed against tables, benches overturned, mugs shattered on the floor. A brawl might spill into the lane, neighbors dragged in whether willing or not. A zine wound from knife or club could turn merriment into mourning, laughter into crime. Words themselves were weapons. Slander and insult carried weight, for honor was precious and reputation fragile. To call a man a thief, a woman unchaste, a neighbor dishonest, was to wound deeply, sometimes more than blows. Disputes over words often came before courts, for speech could tear a village apart. 'Tis surely the violence. To accuse falsely was itself a crime, but to endure insult without answer was unbearable. Thus quarrels flared, sharpened by pride, inflamed by gossip, spreading through the lanes like fire through thatch. When brawls broke out, the village stirred quickly. The cry went up, neighbors rushed, torches flared. Some tried to pull fighters apart, others cheered them on, children darting close to see. Yet all knew that what happened in the heat of anger would what end in the lane alone. Injuries meant questions, questions meant court, and court meant punishment. The steward or reeve would hear of it, fines would be levied, and those who had fought would pay in coin or labor for the peace they had broken. Yet not disputes ended with punishment. Some were settled by mediation, elders stepping in to calm tempers, priests urging forgiveness, neighbors reminding one another of the bonds they shared. A handshake before the altar, a promise made on oath, might restore harmony. Fines would be paid, wounds healed, friendships mended. For in the village no one lived apart, Enemies were also neighbors, and grudges could not be sustained without harming all. Still, the memory of quarrels lingered. Old insults were not forgotten, old wounds not easily forgiven. The man who once raised a knife in anger might be watched with suspicion for years. The woman accused of slander might find her words weighed more harshly. Crime in the village was not only punished by court but by memory, by the whispers that followed long after the steward fine was paid. At night, when villagers led by hearths, stories of the day quarrels were told again and then. Children listened, learning who had fought, who had spoken harshly, who had made peace. In this way, the history of disputes became part of the village story, woven into its memory bay tightly day harvests and feasts. Thus crime was not always the act of strangers or shadows. Often it was born in the ordinary life of the village, in fields, in taverns, in words spoken too sharply. It rose from hunger, from pride, from the closeness of lives bound together. Though courts and fines might restore the balance, the memory of quarrels remained, a reminder that peace was fragile, that crime could begin with nothing more than a pig in the beans, a mug of ale too may, or a word too harshly spoken. When quarrels grew too sharp, when theft was discovered, when wounds were left in the dust of the lane, the village turned to the manor court. It was here, beneath the eye of the Lord Steward, that justice was measured and peace restored, not always perfectly, but visibly, so that all might know the law still held sway. The manor court was no lofty hall of marble and robed judges. It was often held in a barn, a church porch, or beneath the spreading branches of a great tree. Villagers sat on benches or stood in a circle, their breath misting in the morning air, their voices hushed as they waited. The steward sat at a table, a clerk beside him with parchment and quill, ready to record the day matters. A staff of office, a seal, or the Lord banner might be displayed, reminders that this was not merely talk, but the business of law. Attendance was not optional. Each household owed suit to the court, bound to appear when summoned, to serve as jurors, to bear witness, to hear judgments. Even those with no quarrel of their own were drawn in, for the law was communal, not private. A villager absent without cause might himself be fined, his name entered in the rolls with the mark of neglect. The court was the village in microcosm, its order made visible. Cases varied in weight. The simplest were of small thefts, a chicken missing, an apple tree stripped, a scythe borrowed and not returned. The accused stood before the steward, head bowed, neighbors whispering in the crowd. If guilt was clear, a fine was levied, perhaps a few pennies, perhaps more if the theft was brazen. The money went to the Lord coffers, but the true purpose was the restoration of order, the public reminder that theft would not be ignored. Quarrel and brawls came often. Two men accused each other of assault, each nursing bruises, each insisting he was provoked. Witnesses were hauled, neighbors questioned, the steward listening with stern patience. At last he pronounced judgment, fines to both, perhaps heavier to the one found more at fault. If blood had been spilled, the fine rose higher, for the king peace had been broken. All present nodded, for though neither man was satisfied, both knew the matter was now closed, or at least bound by law. This that strang up both nice and filed her to the hooked, a one had moved, a furrow plowed too wide, a path blocked. Such cases would drag on, with witnesses summons, charters wrought forth, oaths sworn upon holy books. The steward weighed all, his clerk scratching down each word. The judgment once made was binding, and to defy it was perilous, for the Lord Court was no mere council of neighbors, but a link in the chain of royal justice. The court also served Dade's memory. It recorded not only crimes, but customs, who owed service on which days, who held which strips of land, who had the right to graze sheep on the common. In its rolls were written the life of the village, binding past to present. To lose a case was not only to pay a fine, but to alter the rut itself, a scar written into parchment that might endure for generations. Oaths were central. The accused might swear innocence, hand upon the Gospels, voice steady before God and neighbors alike. If his reputation was strong, if his tithing supported him, the oath might suffice. But if doubt lingered, the steward could demand compurgation, others swearing to his honesty, pledging their own souls upon his truth. To fail in such said oath, to be found lying, was ruinous, for perjury endangered not only reputation but salvation. Few dared risk it, and so oaths carried weight beyond coin. Punishments in the manor court were often fines, sometimes duties of labor or loss of property. Prison was rare, for cells were scarce and costly. The aim was not long confinement, but quick correction, a restoration of balance through payment, service, or shame. Yet the threat of harsher judgment loomed always, for raid crimes, murder, arson, repeated theft might be sent upward to the sheriff and the king justices, where gallows and dungeons awaited. The crowd itself was part of the court power. Neighbors watched, sees names were read, fines were pronounced, and oaths were sworn. Their presence gave weight, for justice seen was justice believed. Children clutched their mothers' hands, learning through fear what words could not teach, that law was real, that crime had consequence, that order bound them. When the business was done, the steward dismissed the court with formal words. Villagers drifted away, grumbling, unrelieved, assassined. The clerk rolled up the parchment, the steward packed his seals, and the tree or bar returned to silence. Yet the memory lingered, the thief bowed head, the quarreller's bruises, the steward's stern voice. Thus the manor court stood, the everyday face of justice, neither lofty nor distant, but woven into village life, visible, audible, unforgettable. It was here that crime was named, punishment given, peace restored, and the fragile fabric of community mended. And though its judgments were simple, they echoed long, shaping memory, reputation, and the rhythm of law in the medieval world. Beyond the manor court, Vines and oaths sufficed to mend quarrels and punish petty thefts. There stood a sterner arm of authority, the King Justice. When crimes were too vive, too violent, or too disruptive for the village to contain, the matter passed upward into the hands of sheriffs, justices, and royal officials. Their coming was rare, but when it occurred, it left a mark upon memory, for it was the presence of the crown itself descending upon village life. The sheriff was the king man in the shire, a figure of weight and dread. He rode with armed men, his cloak bearing the mark of office, his seal granting power. Villagers paused and stared when his party entered a town, hooves striking sparks upon stone, banners fluttering. He brought with him the authority of the monarch, distant yet palpable, a reminder that beyond lord and steward stood a greater law, the king peace binding all. His duties were many. He levied taxes and rents, summoned men for military service, carried out writs from the royal chancery, but most feared was his role in law. He hunted fugitives, seized accused men, and brought them before higher courts. When gallows were raised, it was often under his command, his men standing guard, justice was carried out. To hear that the sheriff was coming was to know that mercy would be scarce, for his task was not to soothe but to enforce. Royal justices, too, traveled the land, holding assizes in market towns. These were great occasions, their arrival rocked by ceremony. Crowds thawed in squares, villagers craned to see, merchants pressed close, children stared in awe. Beneath canopies or within guild halls, the justices sat, robes heavy, seals displayed. Clerks unrolled long parchments filled with names and cases, the ink dark against vellum. The business of law, once local and familiar, now stretched to encompass many villages, many crimes, all weighed beneath the king's gaze. At such sessions, grave crimes were heard, murder, arson, robbery, treason. The accused were wrought in chains, guarded by armed men. Witnesses stepped forward, voices trembling liens they spoke. Juries of villagers gave verdicts, swearing upon their souls. The justices listened, stern and remote, their judgments final. Punishments here were not small fines, but death, mutilation, or long imprisonment. The gallows outside the town stood ready, its beams stark against the sky. For villagers unaccustomed to such severity, the sight was unforgettable. A thief who in Manor Court might have paid pennies here, might lose his hand. A murderer faced hanging without hope of pardon. The crowd watched in silent stays, ropes were tied, the condemned confessed sins, priests murmured prayers. The sheriff gave the signal, the trap fell, the body swung. Justice, harsh in public, was done. Children clung to their mothers, men removed their caps, women crossed themselves. None forgot. Yet even if mercy sometimes intervened, the king might grant pardon, often at the request of a lord, a bishop, or for payment of heavy sums. To receive such mercy was rare, but when it came, it was celebrated de miracle. The condemned, released, walked among neighbors once more, a living reminder of both severity and grace. The sheriff reach extended even into daily life. His men hunted outlaws, riding into forests, setting traps along roads. They pursued fugitives across shires, their writs granting them authority wherever they went. To harbor such a man was perilous, for the sheriff's wrath fell heavily on those who defied him. Yet the villagers, out of kinship or pity, dared to aid the hunted, hiding them in barns, feeding them in secret, knowing full well the danger. The presence of the King Justice brought awe, fear, and sometimes resentment. For while villagers trusted their own courts to know them, to weigh their quarrels with their sense of custom and mercy, the royal officials were outsiders. They came with parchments and proclamants, unfamiliar with local disputes, more concerned with the letter of law than the bonds of neighborly life. Their justice was swift and harsh, leaving little room for compromise. Yet it was necessary, for without it the most violent crimes might fester unchecked. When the justices departed, when the sheriff men rode away, a hush often lingered. Villagers returned to fields and hearths, shaken by what they had seen. The gallows might remain standing, good reminder of authority. The memory of trials and punishments remained vivid, shaping behavior for years. Parents warned children, mind your temper, mind your tongue, for the King Justice sees all. Thus the sheriff and the King Justices stood as the long arm of power, stretching from distant castles and courts into the smallest villages. They brought fear, awe, and sometimes hope, reminding all that the law was not only local custom but royal command, not only the word of steward or priest, but the authority of crown and kingdom. In their presence, crime seemed heavy, punishment inevitable, and the weight of order undeniable. In the medieval world, words carried a weight almost as heavy as iron chains. For in a society wheat's written records were scarce and witnesses often few, the spoken oath stood at the heart of justice. To swear was not merely to promise, it was to bind one's soul before God, to stake salvation upon truth. And when guilt or innocence hung in the balance, oaths became the thread from which verdicts were woven. When a man stood accused before the Manor Court or the King Justices, he might be asked to wage his law to clear himself by oath. He would place his hand upon the Gospels or the relics of a saint, his fingers trembling slightly, his eyes lowered. The clerk recited the solemn words, and the accused repeated them, swearing that he was innocent of the charge, that he had spoken no falsehood, that God himself was witness to his truth. To rake such said oath was perjury, and perjury was no small crime. It endangered not only earthly reputation, but eternal soul. Yet rarely was a single oath enough to support his claim. The accused might need to gather compurgators, neighbors, or kin willing to swear alongside him. These men, often 12 in number, stood beside the accused, hands raised, voices steady, swearing not that they knew him innocent, but that they believed his oath was true. Their honor was pledged with his, their souls risked with his fate. For a man of good standing, respected in his tithing, compurgators came readily. but for one distrusted or shunned, few would step forward, and without them his case collapsed. Thus reputation became valuable coin, to live honestly, to treat neighbors fairly, to be known trustworthy. These were not only virtues, but safeguards against future peril. A man known for quarreling, thieving, or slandering might find himself unable to muster oaths when he most needed them, abandoned by neighbors unwilling to risk their own salvation for his sake. In this way, the law was not only enforced in courts, but in daily life, in the fragile weave of honor and trust. Witnesses too swore oaths, their testimony bound by sacred words. To lie was perilous, for if discovered, the liar faced not only earthly punishment, but eternal damnation. Yet temptation remained, and disputes sometimes devolved into contests of credibility, each side marshalling oaths to outweigh the other. The steward or justice weighed the balance, but always it was the oath itself that stood as the final thread of truth. Even lords and sheriffs respected the sanctity of oaths. A captured thief might beg to be tried not by ordeal or rope, but by his sworn word, if he could find compurgators to stand with him. Sometimes villages themselves swore oaths, was declaring that no crime had been committed within their bounds, or that a fugitive had not been harbored. The collective word of the community was powerful, a shield against suspicion, though dangerous if false, for should the lie be discovered, punishment would fall upon all. The ritual of swearing was solemn. The church was often the stage, candles lit, relics displayed, the gospel book laid open. The accused touched holy objects, sometimes kissed them, though sealing his words with reverence. Priests stood by, reminding all that God's eye pierced every deceit, that no lie could escape judgment. To swear falsely was to risk not only gallows but damnation, and the fear of eternal fire kept many tongues truthful. Yitrat trusted oaths alone. Some muttered that men of silver tongue might persuade compurgators, or that neighbors might swear out of kinship rather than truth. So when doubt lingered, harsher tests were invoked, ordeals of iron and water, that God was asked to reveal guilt directly. These were feared, for their outcome was terrible, but they reflected the same belief that truth could not be hidden from heaven, that God himself was the final judge. Still, for most disputes, oaths sufficed. They were practical, swift, and deeply feared. Villagers remembered who had sworn well, who had faltered, whose voice had trembled, whose reputation had carried weight. They learned that justice was not only in courts, but in daily conduct, in how they were known and trusted. In this way, the oath bound not only the present case, but the fabric of community, weaving honesty, reputation, and law into one. At night, when villagers vetted by hearths, they spoke of the day trials. He swore well, one might say, nodding at a neighbor acquitted man would doubt him, or he found few to stand with him, his life of quarreling has cost him dear. Children listened, learning the lesson, live honestly, guard your reputation, for one day your life may hang on the words you speak before God. Thus, trials and oaths were more than rituals of law. They were acts of faith, moments when the unseen judge was brought upon to witness truth. They shaped daily life, kept reputation bright, punished deceit, and reminded all that in every word, every promise, every dispute, heaven listened, though fines and punishments might be given by stewards and sheriffs. It was the oath, the trembling hand upon the holy book, that carried the heaviest weight of all. The medieval world was steep in faith, its days measured by bells and feast days, its stories filled with saints and miracles. Yet even in such an age, doubts sometimes stirred, quiet questions whispered by firelight, uneasy thoughts hidden behind bowed heads at Mass. For though miracles were many and saints were near, the human heart is never without its shadows of uncertainty. Some doubted the relics themselves. Was the bone in the reliquary truly from the saint proclaimed, or from common grave? Could so many churches all possess fragments of the true cross, when one alone should have sufficed? Whispers rose in taverns and markets, not shouted but murmured. Men and women wondered whether merchants and priests sometimes profited from credulous devotion. These questions rarely reached open defiance, for to doubt too loudly risks scandal or even punishment. Yet they lingered, shaping a more cautious reverence. Others questioned the tales of miracles, a fever that broke after prayer. Was it truly the saint hand, or merely the body's strength returning? A storm diverted. Was it prayer or the natural shift of winds? A child healed at a well, was it grace? Or chance villagers who asked such things did so softly? For they feared not only censure, but their own hearts. Yet the questions came, born from the same weariness and realism that came from hard toil in field and home. Priests and preachers knew of these doubts and sought to guide them. They urged that faith was not about measuring proof, but about trusting God nearness. Miracles, they said, were signs for the faithful, not arguments for the skeptical. To believe was itself a grace, a gift that opened the soul to receive blessing. To doubt was human, but to surrender doubt to prayer was holy. In sermons they reminded their flocks that Thomas himself had doubted until he touched Christ's wounds, that he was not cast aside but welcomed with mercy. For many, faith and doubt lived side by side. A mother might whisper suspicion when a neighbor healing seemed exaggerated, yet still pray with tears for her own child recovery. A farmer might scoff at tales of visions, yet still carry a scallop shell with reverence. Doubt did not always weaken faith. Sometimes it sharpened it, turning simple trust into deeper reflection, pressing the heart to cling more firmly to what it chose to believe. There were also those who leaned toward disbelief more strongly. Some mocked relics, calling them trinkets. Some laughed at stories of saints appearing in dreams. Some muttered that miracles were inventions of priests to draw coins into coffers. These voices were rare in the village, for public scorn brought danger, but they grew louder in towns and courts, especially among those more educated. Scholars debated, clerics argued, councils investigated. Faith endured, but not without struggle. Yet for most villagers the balance was simple. Doubt might whisper, but faith spoke louder. They had little choice, for in a world of hunger, disease, and war, hope was necessary. To believe that saints watched over them, that holy water healed, that relics protected, was to find strength against despair. Doubt might gnaw, but it could not feed the hungry, heal the sick, or comfort the grieving. Faith could, and so faith prevailed. In a way, the very presence of doubt made belief stronger. To choose trust despite questions was to make faith an act of courage, not merely habit. Villagers knew their hearts wavered, yet still they knelt, still they lit candles, still they sang hymns. Their devotion was not blind but persevering, a pilgrimage of the spirit that walked through shadow way-led light. At night, when shadows lengthened and silence pressed upon cottages, doubts sometimes returned. Men stared into embers, wondering if the saints truly heard. Women rocked sick children, wondering if prayers would avail. Yet even then they prayed. They prayed because prayer itself was comfort, because to cry out to heaven was better than silence, because to believe was to hope, and to hope was to live. Thus the medieval world was not a place of unthinking certainty, but of faith lived amid questions. Miracles were cherished, relics revered, visions treasured, but doubt was never wholly absent. And in that tension lay the true strength of devotion, not in the absence of uncertainty, but in the decision to believe, to trust, to walk the road of the soul with eyes lifted upward, even when shadows lingered at the edge. For many pilgrims, the climax of devotion was not only the relic or shrine itself, but the cathedral that housed it. These towering structures of stone rose above towns and fields like mountains of faith, their spires reaching toward heaven, their bells tolling across valleys, their stained glass windows spilling colored light into shadowed naves. To step within them was to step into another world, one where heaven seemed near, and earth burdens grew lighter. The journey to a cathedral began long before its doors. Pilgrims approaching from the road saw towers rising far in the distance, guiding them like beacons. The sight of Canterbury Great Church, of Santiago Twin Towers, of the Lateran in Rome, quickened tired steps. Villagers who had never seen a building taller than their parish steeple stood awestruck before walls that soared higher than trees, carved with saints, angels, and scenes of Scripture. For many, the cathedral was itself a miracle of stone and labor, proof that human hands, guided by faith, could shape mountains. The entrance was rocked by carvings that preached without words. Portals showed the Last Judgment, Christ enthroned in majesty, angels weighing souls, demons dragging the damned. Figures of saints and apostles lined the doors, their stone faces serene, their gestures beckoning. Pilgrims traced their fingers along worn carvings, whispering prayers before stepping into the dim coolness within. Then fared the vastness overwhelmed. The high vaults arched of the ribs of a great ship, carrying the soul upward. Candles glowed in side chapels, their flames flickering against golden altars, incense curled in the air, sweet and heavy, mingling with the faint sound of chanting. Light poured through stained glass windows, turning walls into stories of saints, miracles, and scripture. A child might stand transfixed at the sight of a saint life told in colored glass, the sun itself painting the floor with holy images. At the heart of the cathedral stood the shrine, often raised high upon a platform, covered in gold and jewels, surrounded by candles and offerings. It drew pilgrims as a star draws sailors. Kneeling before it, pilgrims pressed lips to cold stone, left coins, lit candles, or touched tokens to its surface. Some wept openly, others knelt in silent awe, still others sang psalms of thanksgiving. Around them, a steady tide of devotion ebbed and flowed, each pilgrim carrying hopes, fears, and gratitude to the same holy place. The cathedral was not only shrine but world in miniature, guilds processed with banners, monks chanted in choirs, bishops preached from pulpits, kings knelt in confession. The poor and the rich, the learned and the illiterate, the native and the foreigner, all found place beneath the same vaults. For in cathedrals all were pilgrims, all were equal in prayer, all were small beneath the vastness of heaven represented in stone. Music filled the spaces with a beauty almost unearthly. Organs thundered, choirs soared, silent voices rose like larks in dawn. The sound seemed to vibrate in the very stones, lifting hearts with it. Pilgrims who had walked weeks in mud and silence now heard the harmony of heaven, and many felt tears rise unbidden. To sing within a cathedral was to feel oneself part of a chorus far greater, joined not only by those present, but by saints and angels unseen. The cathedrals themselves bore witness to generations, built across decades, even centuries. They represented the devotion of countless lives, masons who carved stone until hands were scarred, glassmakers who cut and joined colors into light, carpenters who raised beams into dizzying heights. To pray within them was to join hands across time, to share in the labor and offering of all who had shaped them. For villages, tales of cathedrals were treasures carried home. A man might describe the soaring vaults, the gleam of reliquaries, the music of choirs. A woman might tell of the candles blazing like stars, of stained glass windows that turned sunlight into jewels. Children listened wide-eyed, imagining such splendor, dreaming of one day seeing it with their own eyes. And even those who never left their village felt uplifted, knowing that such wonders existed in their world. At night, when cathedrals stood in silence, their towers outlined against stars, candles still burned around shrines. Pilgrims slept in cloisters, their dreams filled with the echoes of chants and the glow of windows. The cathedral became not only a house of stone, but a house of memory, imprinting itself upon the soul, a place where heaven touched earth with unmatched majesty. Thus the great cathedrals stood milestones of pilgrimage, symbols of the vast communion of the faithful, monuments of labor and devotion. They were not merely buildings, but prayers in stone, songs in glass, offerings in gold. To walk within them was to feel the presence of saints and angels, to glimpse the radiance of heaven, and to carry that vision home, where it might shine quietly in the heart forever. The pilgrim road was long, yet every road, whether to Compostela or to a village well, whether to Rome or only to the parish church, ended in rest. For the medieval heart understood that pilgrimage was not endless wandering, but a journey with pauses, havev, and at last a final homecoming. And just shrines offered relief to weary feet, so too did prayer and memory offer rest to the spirit. After the feasts and processions ended, after relics were returned to their shrines, after the last candle flickered low in cathedral naves, villagers carried holiness back into their ordinary days. A scallop cell hung by the hearth, a vial of water from a spring placed on a shelf, a badge binned to a cloak. All became quiet reminders of journeys made. Children traced their fingers over these tokens, asking again for the stories of the road, of the saints, of the miracles, and in the telling, the pilgrimage continued, stretching its blessing into generations yet unborn. Rest in the spirit did not mean an end to longing. Even those who had never left their parish felt the pull of holy places, the yearning to see relics, to touch shrines, to walk where saints had walked. Yet they found peace in knowing that holiness was already near, in the church bells, in the village well, in the cross at the roadside. Every lane, every field, every hearth would be a resting place of grace, if eyes were open to see it. The saints themselves were companions of rest. Their relics might rest in reliquaries, their bones unmoving beneath gilded cases, yet their presence was felt the living. Villagers spoke of them, bade neighbors, prayed to them, protectors, sang their hymns these, though calling on fens. To rest in their company was to know that the journey was shared, that heaven was not a far country, but a household already waiting with open doors. Night itself carried a sense of pilgrimage of end. As villagers lay down upon straw beds, their bodies weary from toil, they crossed themselves, whispered prayers, and commended their souls to God. Sleep was a little death, but also a little homecoming. A pause along the road with spirit found quiet shelter. Dreams filled with saints and visions made the night a resting place for the soul, preparing it for dawn journey onward. The greatest rest awaited beyond life's final mile. All believed that death was not a full stop, but a passage into the ultimate shrine. Graves were dug near churches, so that even in death, villagers lay within the sound of bells, the shadow of altars, the company of saints. Candles burned at vigils. Prayers rose for souls in purgatory, helping them on their last pilgrimage. And in this belief, death itself was softened, not terror, but homecoming, not loss, but rest at last in the presence of God. The medieval heart found peace in knowing that every journey, whether long or short, pointed toward the same end. The pilgrim who returned from Compostela to his cottage, the mother who prayed at a village well, the child who dreamed of saints by firelight, all walked the same road in spirit. And in their resting they tasted already the promise of heaven, that one day all pilgrims would lay down their staffs, remove their dusty cloaks, and be welcomed into a house not built by hands, where light never faded and songs never ceased. So the episode closes and began with the image of life pilgrimage, a journey of spirit rocked by signs and miracles, by saints and shrines, by doubts and hopes. The medieval world saw itself not rooted in one place only, but walking always toward a greater country. Along the way there were wells, chapels, processions, visions, and cathedrals, each a resting place, each a glimpse of what awaited at the end. The journey was long, yet it was sweet, for pilgrims knew that they walked not alone. Saints walked beside them, miracles lightened their steps, holy places gave them pause, and at last God Himself waited at the end of the road. To rest in the Spirit was to know this truth, to feel it deep in the heart, to carry it into sleep like a lullaby, that every step, however weary, led not into darkness but into light.